You're listening to One Concerned American. This is the third episode in a series of videos overviewing conspiracies throughout the history of the United States. In this video, we're going to break down how Andrew Jackson fundamentally changed the office of the President of the United States. And to get you thinking about this topic, I want you to examine this painting very carefully. This is an image of Andrew Jackson's inauguration party, and if you notice, he had a bunch of people in the White House. You can see alcohol spilled all over the floor. You can see a child trampling barefoot through the place. And you also see people stomping over the American flag. And this is some heavy symbolism that's going to reflect exactly what Jackson did to change this country. So I want you to sit back, relax, and open your mind a little bit. Because we all know that recently Andrew Jackson's been a hot topic of discussion. People are talking about changing the $20 bill from his face to Harriet Tubman. You've got Donald Trump featuring a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the White House. And everybody thinks it's a big deal. Trump has actually likened himself to Andrew Jackson a few times. So I want to explain in this video why that's not a very good thing and why Jackson isn't exactly the president that you think he is. But before we get started, we have to go back and examine the War of 1812, because that's where Jackson really became famous and became a national figure. And to get started, I want you to think about this letter that was sent from the Governor General of Canada, Sir James Henry Craig, to a spy in the United States named John Henry. And he said, quote, "I request you proceed with the earliest convenience to Boston. The known intelligence and ability of several of its leading men must give it a considerable influence over the other states, and will probably lead them in the part they are to take. It has been supposed that if the Federalists of the Eastern states should be successful, and obtain the decided influence which may enable them to direct public opinion, it is not improbable that, rather than submit, they will exert that influence to bring about a separation from the general union." So you can see here that the Canadians, who were operating as a wing of the British Empire, they were fomenting with American spies, people like John Henry, who had actually written about his hatred for American federalism, trying to see if they could bring about some type of separation in the United States. And you can actually go online and you can look up the John Henry Papers. On the left here, you can see that this is actually a portrait of Sir James Henry Craig, but we don't exactly have any images of John Henry. So you'd have to find his papers online if you wanted to research a little bit more about that. So in the last video, we talked about how the French were trying to influence the Americans to go to war with the British. We had people like Edmund Genet who were raising armies here on American soil. And now we know that the British also had agents here in the United States that were looking to overthrow our system of government. And James Madison also knew this. On March 9th of 1812, he gave a statement to Congress where he said, quote, "I lay before Congress copies of certain documents that prove that the British government, through its public minister here, a secret agent of that government, was employed in certain states, more especially at the seat of government in Massachusetts, in fomenting disaffection to the constituted authorities of the country, and intrigued with the disaffected for the purpose of bringing about resistance to the laws, and eventually, in concert with the British force, of destroying the Union, and forming the eastern part thereof into a political connection with Great Britain." Additionally, there were many other factors that led to the War of 1812, like British support of Indian raiders, competition in the fur trade. You had some expansionists that thought we should go in and take Canada. There were British sailors that were actually impressing American sailors and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. You also had British blockades of American goods. So there was a powder keg of events that were leading to the War of 1812. And a lot of people don't realize how close this country came to actually being completely occupied by Great Britain. There was a lot of hard fighting, mostly from William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson, that helped save this war. The United States almost completely was destroyed. The White House was burned. A lot of people know that James Madison and his wife had to flee the White House. And a lot of people are really unaware also of the steps that Andrew Jackson had to take to actually help win this war in New Orleans. Jackson declared martial law. He ordered French inhabitants into the interior. He drafted men to fight and confiscated anything of value for the war effort. He actually arrested a judge who had issued writs of habeas corpus over arbitrary arrests. and he was fined $1,000 for his actions during the war. Now, he was paid back with interest in 1843, but we need to realize that the whole effort in the War of 1812 was really confusing on both sides. I mean, on one hand, you had people in the South who were mostly the war hawks in this effort, and then you had mostly people in New England that were against the war because it disrupted their trade efforts. And honestly, it was really just brought on by foreign influence, and you had the fact that the war was financed by loans proposed by Albert Gallatin, and these things proved disastrous for the economy. So that was a major problem that a lot of people don't even really know about, and it's some information that a lot of people have actually tried to hide about Jackson over the years. And interestingly, in New England, they had a secession movement going on at that time. There was a meeting called the Hartford Convention, where several states from New England all considered leaving and actually forming their own confederation because they had been so disrupted in their shipping and trading industries from the war and through Thomas Jefferson's earlier embargo acts. So you can see here, there's an image of the representatives thinking about jumping into the hands of the King of England. You can see that another image also depicts the candidates from the Hartford Convention basically as demons, and the people of liberty are those who basically fought against the British. So the propaganda was in full swing at this time, and Andrew Jackson became kind of a folk hero. I mean, his men set up cotton bale defenses to help win the Battle of New Orleans and help save the day. You had New England states that wanted to leave, and then you had several senators that were in between, and representatives that basically just thought Andrew Jackson had taken too much power out of this whole situation. For example, Henry Clay once said, quote, "I hope gentlemen will deliberately survey the awful isthmus on which we stand. They may bear down on all opposition. They may even vote the general public thanks. They may carry him triumphantly through this house, but if they do, in my humble judgment, it will be the triumph of the principle of insubordination, a triumph of the military over the civil authority, a triumph over the powers of this house, a triumph over the constitution of the land, and I pray most devoutly to heaven that it may not prove in its ultimate effects and consequences a triumph over the liberties of the people." So, regardless of how you feel about Jackson, the war wouldn't have been won without him, but he also took steps that were basically illegal at that time to help win that war. So it did launch him to kind of a folk hero status, and as a result, a lot of mythology has surrounded Andrew Jackson over the years. For example, this is an excerpt of a speech that William Jennings Bryan gave about Jackson. He said, quote, "If you will read what Thomas Benton said, you will find that he said that in searching history he could find but one parallel to Andrew Jackson. That was Cicero, who destroyed the conspiracies of Catiline and saved Rome. He did for Rome what Jackson did when he destroyed the bank conspiracy and saved America." Well, the problem is that that's basically propaganda that Jackson and his kitchen cabinet helped cook up to help win him a lot more popular support. And we'll see as we go along that Andrew Jackson really didn't destroy the bank. In fact, before he did anything, the charter for the bank was almost up. So he could have not done anything and the bank would have been gone by the end of his presidency as long as he didn't recharter it. But we need to go back and understand that the original US bank had some stock owned by foreign interests, but it never published a complete list of the stockholders. Andrew Jackson at one point did understand that there was value to a national bank, but he wanted the bank to be a part of the Treasury. So he closed the original bank, moved the money power into 7 state-chartered pet banks that were owned by associates. And also during this time, property qualifications were removed from voting, so basically any white man could vote as long as you were of the certain age, and they removed religious qualifications to hold office in some states. So you can see on the left there's some propaganda at the time that says Jackson is to be president and you will be hanged. Well, it's because as a military commander, Jackson did have to take some authoritarian steps to win the Battle of New Orleans and to help take Florida at one point. But when you look at what he really did with the banks, it's just a bunch of propaganda. He didn't really destroy it. He just took the money out and put it in some nationally owned banks and distributed it around. So a lot of the times when you see these old political cartoons about Jackson being so disturbed about the bank, It's really just a lot of propaganda to really appeal to the common folk, because he really didn't do anything to change the status of the bank, and we're going to show you that over the next few slides. For example, if you read the book Fundamental Issues of the Bank War by Thomas Govan, he said, quote, "Neither Jackson nor his advisors were interested in a real and fundamental examination of the American credit system and its requirements." And he said, Jackson first prevented its recharter, then placed the public deposits in the state banks, and finally, this experiment proving unsuccessful, talked of a specie currency without either taking or proposing the steps necessary to achieve his avowed purpose. Going on, and this is a long quote, he said, Jackson was bent upon the destruction of the bank. To gain popular support, he and the small but determined group around him denounced a wealthy aristocracy and paper money, but the people who supported Jackson and his friends were misled and deceived, because no effective attempt was made to limit the powers or profits of the state bankers, the brokers, or the speculators, or to create an adequate and sound substitute currency. Certainly, no one can examine the subsequent history of the United States and find that the influence of wealth was lessened by Jackson's financial policies, or that the opportunity for speculative profits was decreased. The sole accomplishment of this reform movement was the elimination of the public responsibilities and functions of the national bank. The state banks, the currency, and the credit structure were left without controls, guidance, or support, subject to the unrestrained effects of the laws of trade, speculative manipulation, and foreign influence. So here's a political cartoon from the time that a little bit more accurately portrays what was happening at this time. It shows Jackson sitting on the government's funds and holding a bag of money as patronage seekers bow down before him. Because again, he didn't destroy the bank, he just put it under national control of the federal government. Before, it was a little bit more private. It was a mixture of private and public. He made it completely under the control of his cronies. And there were people north and south that really disagreed with what Jackson did. For example, George McDuffie, who was from South Carolina, he said that such control would introduce more corruption in the government than all the patronage now belonging to it. It was a desperate financial experiment without parallel in the history of the world. And here's another political cartoon. I think this one is called Jackson and the Spoils, or the Spoils of Government, maybe the Spoils of War. And you can see him basically dangling all the little new prizes that he has since he's been elected to office over his supporters, basically making them promises of land and money and good times, parties, just dangling these things over his supporters to really get their support, even though he didn't really change anything. The historian Raymond G. Jettle said this about the Jackson years. He said, quote, "The election of 1828 marked the success of the movement of separation of church and state, a hostile attitude towards the landed interests by the removal of property and religious qualifications, direct control by the people, and a nationalistic movement away from states' rights." So again, take a look at this painting. It's really the downfall of the United States. You can see again people trampling over the flag, alcohol being spilt all over the floor, people are being loud, they're breaking things, they're walking through the White House barefoot. It was making America a lot more democratic. As we'll see in the later videos of this series, democracy is nothing more than socialism. Vladimir Lenin said this, Karl Marx said this. Really, democracy is the essence of socialism. Jackson just softened us up for it. That's all he really did. If you look at the nullification crisis, Jackson's own Vice President John C. Calhoun, he authored a document that was called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, and this was encouraging states to nullify the tariff of 1828, specifically South Carolina. Later on, our state authored the Ordinance of Nullification to void the tariff of 1832, and later on, South Carolina authored the Ordinance of Nullification to void the tariff of 1832. So Jackson ended up issuing a proclamation that asserted federal authority, and then Congress passed a force bill. So Jackson basically destroyed states' rights when he was president. He brought a little bit more democracy to America by letting basically any white male vote who was of the age. He brought a little bit of moral decline into office, and we saw that through things like the party at the White House, and just the general attitude with the dropping of religious requirements throughout the states at that time. So Jackson was a disaster for the state authority, he was a disaster for the republic, he was a disaster for states' rights. And you can see at this time the propaganda made Calhoun look like a vicious snake, so people who were wanting to support states' rights and nullification and secession, they were depicted as venomous snakes, whereas Jackson was depicted as the strong eagle, the representative of American liberty. And this is what Calhoun actually said about Andrew Jackson. He said, quote, "Infatuated man, blinded by ambition, intoxicated by flattery and vanity, who that is the least acquainted with the human heart, who that is conversant with the pages of history, does not see, under all this, the workings of a dark, lawless, and insatiable ambition." He claims to be not only the representative, but the immediate representative of the American people. What effrontery, what boldness of assertion, the immediate representative. Why, he never received a vote from the American people. He was elected by the electors. So remember, Calhoun, he was a big believer in the Republic. He believed that the Constitution was a compact between the states, like Article 7 actually says. So he tried to reinforce that, and some of these ideas contributed to the Civil War later on. And Andrew Jackson was quoted as having said later on, "After 8 years as president, I only have 2 regrets, that I have not shot Henry Clay or hanged John C. Calhoun." So when you ask me, am I upset that Harriet Tubman might replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill? I'd say no. Because if you really believed our own myths and propaganda about Jackson, then you wouldn't want his face on a paper bill anyway. But honestly, the truth about it is that he brought us closer to this crappy system that we're living under now. He made us more democratic. He was not a great president on race. He actually fired a man who wrote one time that Indians were the intellectual equal of white men. So there were some things about him that were a little bit questionable. I think that as a president, he did a lot more than he was constitutionally authorized to do. So I have no problem with someone replacing him on the $20 bill. I think that it's time that we all need to grow up and stop believing in the myths in our history and start looking for the actual facts. So stay tuned and we'll keep exposing the truth about American history.